First of all, I would like to thank the Berkeley Center and the Rumi Forum and my good friends Emily and Sidki and Jenna for inviting me to participate in this event. I would like to start by saying that this short presentation is based on some work in progress at my institution that in fact we just began a couple of months ago on the processes. Hi Marina, come in. Just began. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Was saying that my presentation is based on work in progress on a project that we just began about a month ago on the processes of democratization and transitions from authoritarianism to democracy on different continents in what Samuel Huntington called, the third wave of democratization, with a view to derive lessons as to what were the critical factors in these processes and what led to the success or failure of these efforts at democratization, and what these experiences can tell us to inform policy toward the ongoing democratic revolution in the Arab world today. Before developing this topic further, we need to define what do we mean by civil society. Because everybody talks about civil society, but no one says what it is. And in fact, there is no accepted definition of civil society. The World Bank has adopted a definition that refers to the wide array of non-governmental and non-for-profit organizations that have a presence in public life, expressing the interests and values of their members, and others based on ethical, cultural, political, scientific, religious, or philanthropic considerations. Specifically, the term civil society organizations, or CSOs for short, is used to refer to entities such as community groups, non-governmental organizations, NGOs. So NGOs are a subset of civil society, but obviously not the whole thing. Labor unions, indigenous groups, charities, faith-based organizations, professional associations, and foundations. And we use the term in our work to refer to all of the civic, social, cultural, and religious institutions and organizations that form the basis of society and operate outside of the state, but within the framework of the law. Civil society is intrinsic to a well-functioning democratic state. In democratic states, the operations of civil society organizations are complementary to those of the state and are underpinned by liberal democratic assumptions and institutions. Some argue that the development of civil society requires freedom of speech, of association, of religion, an independent judiciary, and democratic political institutions. Conversely, there is an inherent tension between civil society and the authoritarian state, especially where civil society organizations become important actors for the delivery of social services and channels for the expression of popular demands. Here, it is important to make a distinction among degrees of authoritarianism in relation to civil society. At the totalitarian end of the scale, for instance, the former communist states, Burma, Syria, Libya, Iraq under the Ba'ath Party, the state controls all organized expressions of society. And this is fundamentally different from authoritarian states, especially those where democratic transitions have occurred, including, for example, the Philippines under Marcos, Indonesia under Suharto, Spain under Franco, Portugal under Salazar, Greece under the colonels, and Brazil, Argentina, and Chile under military regimes, and I would argue Egypt under Mubarak, and Tunisia under Ben Ali, and many other cases numerous to mention here, where the authoritarian regime allowed civil society organizations to operate within certain limitations. For instance, religious and social service organizations were able to function as long as they did not involve themselves in politics or pose a perceived threat to the stability of a regime. For instance, in Indonesia, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, the two largest Muslim civil service organizations in the world, with a membership of between 20 and 30 million members each, operated very much without official interference under the Suharto regime. They ran schools, thousands of schools, universities, the whole university system on the part of Muhammadiyah, hospital, provided social services, and were able to exercise significant influence on political and social issues. The Catholic Church in the Philippines and its leader, Cardinal Sin, under Marcos, not only retained its independence, but constituted one of the most powerful political forces in the Philippines and played a critical role in the replacement of the Marcos regime, as many of you know. Another case in point is the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, although I consider the Hikwan as a political rather than a religious or social entity. Although it was officially banned throughout most of the Mubarak regime, the Brotherhood was allowed to function, to run a complex network of hospitals and social services, and Brotherhood members were allowed to run for parliament and sometimes be elected as independents, of course, not members of the organization. In many, and I would say most cases, authoritarian regimes allowed the independent media, especially the newspapers, because the regimes were usually more concerned about the electronic media that reached the masses than the papers that were generally led by a small elite of a population. Nevertheless, they were allowed to operate, and they used censorship as a vehicle to control the message. And this is a fundamental point, because censorship does not imply actual control of the media. And in some cases, opposition newspapers, such as Kathimerini under the Greek colonels, or La Prensa in Nicaragua, where I served in the 1970s, in the late Somoza period, in the Foreign Service, they actually became the focal points of opposition to the regime. Now, you compare that to the situation in Syria today, or Iraq under Saddam, where no sign of opposition was permitted. Another important component is of NGOs in their role in building up civil society and promoting democracy has been, the NGOs, which I mentioned earlier. And especially the NGOs that take a role in democracy promotion. Some of them are beneficiaries of international funding. And this international connection has provided NGOs not only with the means to carry out their functions, but also with a degree of protection from the regime, particularly where that regime receives international assistance and therefore needs to manifest some respect for the values of the donor countries or institutions. Nevertheless, these NGOs operating in an authoritarian environment need to struggle to maintain their independence, since they are often viewed with suspicion or hostility by the regime. In most cases, the NGOs have to register with the authorities. They have to meet the requirements that the regime might set for registration, clear security investigations, and promise to refrain from activities that the government might object to. The authorities can and do audit operating budgets, infiltrate agents into the major associations, impose arbitrary fines, and could dissolve the group if found to be in violation of some regulation. The governments can pressure international donors to cease funding a group that it objects to, as in the case of Mubarak and the United States. Or, as in the case of Venezuela under Chavez, it could prohibit NGOs from accepting international assistance. Nevertheless, even though they could operate under quite severe restrictions, once the transition begins, the NGOs can play and have played a key role in the consolidation of democracy. The point is that pre-existing civil society institutions and organizations, even if operating under severe restrictions, constitute, judging by the history of successful democratic transitions, a key and maybe an indispensable factor in the consolidation of democratic governance. A body of scholarly literature illustrates this point and argues that in democratic transitions around the world, civil society can facilitate the process by restraining state coercion, increasing the costs of repression, and generating international support for the transition. And according to a study by Freedom House, civic resistance played a vital role in driving 50 out of 67 modern transitions from authoritarian rule to democracy. Having said that, let me add that there are some objections to this thesis. There's always objections to any thesis. And one relates to the definition of civil society organizations. For instance, whether Islamists can be considered part of democratic civil society. I mentioned earlier the Muslim Brotherhood. The question is whether an Islamist organization such as the Brotherhood supports democratic objectives, or whether they seek to use democratic means to impose a different form of authoritarianism, or at least to capture a share of public space for purposes that are not consistent with liberal democracy, or to get away from the problem of Islamism and democracy in cases where the obstacles to democracy derive from the political culture itself, whether NGO activities are infected by undemocratic practices. For instance, a scholar of Southeast Asia noted that the behavior of some NGOs in the Philippines has sometimes been shaped by the pervasive patron-client system that operates in that country, and that this is a system that the NGOs are ostensibly dedicated to change. So, to conclude my presentation, since I'm running out of my 15 minutes, let me say that yes, it's very important, especially as the Arab world moves into this stage of transition, for international actors, the United States especially, to engage civil society. That is not enough to deal on a government-to-government basis. We must try to engage these non-state actors that are driving political change. At the same time, we have to be careful whom to engage. And I think that, as we have noted in some of our other works, there has to be some criteria for the partners that we could have. For instance, do these actors accept the fundamental liberal democratic values that we share? Do they respect the rights of women, religious and ethnic minorities? Do they renounce the use of violence and terrorism to attain their goals? And I think this is the direction that we should go. Thank you.